Hello and welcome to a brand new Arseblog Arsecast right here on arseblog.com. How are you? Hope you're well. Yes, it's midweek. It's Wednesday. It's a special surprise midweek limited edition picture disc episode of the podcast in which I'm going to be talking to Amy Lawrence about her brand new book, which is called 89. Just want to take a moment to thank everybody for all the feedback on the Arsecast Extra on Monday. James and I had a conversation which I think people reacted to in very different ways. But I just want to say thank you to everyone for the feedback, which was provided without too much acrimony, shall I say. And, it's good to have diverse opinions, and it's good that we can all share those diverse opinions without it resorting to the real depths of negativity that exist online, in online discourse, you might say. And it's nice that when you're open and when you're honest about things, that people can appreciate that, even if they don't agree with you, even if they disagree with you very fundamentally. I appreciate the fact that people have taken the time to get in touch, and thank you, as always, for listening. It really is very much appreciated. This episode, though, is not at all something that will provide contentious moments, I don't think. Amy Lawrence has written a brand new book called 89. It is out tomorrow, and Amy's here to talk to us about it right now. Hi, Amy.
Hey, Andrew.
We are talking because tomorrow, Thursday, you have got a brand new book coming out called 89. People, I guess, will figure out what exactly it's about. But just briefly, sort of an outline of the book. On the front cover, Tony Adams has a quote, "Arsenal's greatest moment told in our own words."
Well, I mean, when that was sort of proposed as a thing, straight away you have that sense of question and doubt. Like, can you be categorical about something like that? Can you say this is Arsenal's greatest moment? And I always think that there's got to be an element of doubt, because life is about opinions, and there must be people all over the world that have good reason to dispute, anything that claims to be the best at anything, really. I always remember how Ivan Gazidis in every single AGM used to talk about how the Emirates Stadium was the best stadium in the world. And I thought, well, according to what? Like, who said that? Like, what's the on how is this judged, and who's the independent commission who proclaims that it's the best in the world, or are you just saying it? Anyway, I'm digressing. The point is, you can argue the toss about it, but in my lifetime, it feels unequivocally like the greatest moment, and I think that's because it was a moment. And if anything, this entire project emanates from the fact that I've always been quite fascinated by almost these JFK moment type of events in life, where you have this resonance and this kind of ripple effect where something can happen somewhere in the world, and the reach of it is gargantuan, and how there are individuals, sometimes thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people, who feel affected by that moment.
Yeah.
And from a football point of view, and from an Arsenal point of view, I think that people who were kind of alive and conscious and interested at that time, and even people who weren't that interested or had a passing interest, it was something that shook them. It was something that made people go wow beyond the normal wow factor. It was an extraordinary circumstance. It was an extraordinary drama. And it's very much a moment of its time as well. And one of the things that I loved about putting this together was essentially getting in a time machine and going back to the late 1980s and realizing how all the things that we take for granted nowadays in terms of our access and our communication to all sorts of things, it was very, very much simpler times. And the images that people remember just take you back to a time where a moment felt so significant because you kind of had to be watching, or if you weren't watching, how the hell did you find out about it?
Well, that's it. I mean, I was going to ask you, because obviously you've spoken to George Graham, you've spoken to most of the players. There are fan testimonies in here, which we'll come to in a little while, but I'm really curious as to how it felt for you putting this together, because your experience of being an Arsenal fan at that age. We're the same age, you and I, and it's a kind of formative time of your life, and this seismic event happened, which coincides with this other thing that you love, obviously, as an Arsenal fan. We're all committed and behind the club. And how much of a trip down memory lane was it for you personally, separating it away from what it meant for the players and the manager and all the other fans? But it must have been a real kick to kind of go back and think about life at that time and how you ended up doing the things that you did.
Yeah, and I mean, in many ways, I think that's one of the things that, because you were asking people to go back and remember something 30 years ago, in everybody that I spoke to, and also myself, it's that's quite a considerable moment of time. It's a span, 30 years, and especially as you mentioned, you and I, we were 17, and listeners will be all sorts of ages, but I did feel like that. I remember the feeling of being that kind of age and sort of, in one way, feeling like I knew about everything, and in another way, feeling like I was desperate to experience everything because it was all so tremendously exciting.
Yeah,
and you felt like you had, that world is your oyster feeling felt really sharpened around then because you were old enough to be able to go and do stuff, and you were still young enough that you weren't cynical yet. So there's almost a magic, I think, maybe of being around that kind of age where you're not really a kid, but you're not quite an adult yet properly. It's a kind of golden spot. So all the emotions and all the things that happened felt almost extra deep, perhaps, than things that happened before or after. And again, one of the things I sort of can't get my head around even to this day is the sense that in all my years of being obsessed by football, I feel like the two most profound moments I've ever experienced happened within 6 weeks of each other. And that was the Hillsborough disaster, which was the worst thing that I ever felt in terms of a football-related thing, and Anfield, which was and still is the best. So for those two things to happen in such a closely crushed period of time feels quite weird, and at a time when we were so impressionable,
Yeah, for sure. And in the backdrop of, football these days is polished and packaged, and some might say sanitized, and obviously there are elements of society and football that are far better now than they used to be, facilities and just the lack of danger going to football matches. But this all happened at a time, in the late 80s when life was different and society was different and culture was different. And that to me always paints a really interesting backdrop to this incredible Arsenal moment. And it felt obviously after what happened at Hillsborough, there was a sort of a reassessment of the game and how fans should be treated. And then we sort of head into the 90s and things change in the 90s a little bit. The fan culture, the terrace culture changes as well. And it sort of feels like the end of one particular era, but I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but to me it feels like this weird thing where it's the start of Arsenal achieving success again after 18 years without winning the league title, but also the end of that kind of off-pitch era, or things that were going on behind the scenes in football that weren't that pleasant.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And when we first started working on the film of '89, the provisional title was "The Goal That Changed Everything," and I think that's kind of interesting because we all felt that this was a moment that was almost you didn't recognise it so much at the time, but it felt like a cut-off point from old style football experience. And Michael Thomas, I think, was on £200 a week when he scored that goal, just to give it some kind of perspective.
Yeah.
I remember going to Goodison Park that season, and this was, again, why it all feels a bit seminal, and it was my first season really going away a lot. So, you had that sense of kind of a rite of passage. You're a different kind of fan when you're traipsing up and down the country and turning up in in other people's backyards, and in those days you had to keep your wits about you because it was a bit different, and the energy was different. And I remember standing outside Goodison Park waiting for players to see if I could get an autograph. Feels quite sort of innocent. And now when I go to the Emirates and you see the crowds of people outside who are waiting by where the ramp of the underground car park comes up for the players, and I do recall a little while ago seeing somebody's car with blacked out windows kind of draw down by enough centimetres for a hand to come through to sign a couple of autographs. But it struck me as how impersonal that was. And back in those days at Goodison Park, I think Arsenal had just gone top of the league very recently. It was January maybe, and it was hugely exciting. And the players came out, and you could chat to them. And if you stood around the clock end where the car park was at Highbury, and they would come out in the old JVC Centre and go in their cars, or sometimes they would just come out on foot, marble halls, and in those days, and they might have parked their car up the road or something like that. You could see the players wandering about quite commonly. It just wasn't. It didn't feel like they were as distant and living in the kind of bubble as is the case nowadays. It all felt much closer connected. Anyway, I'm kind of waffling and I can't remember the question originated.
Let me ask you a question then, just sort of moving on from that. Do you think that kind of sense of community is the wrong word, right? But it was maybe a smaller football world because the game hadn't gone quite as global, and it was more difficult for people to keep up with games and with what was going on. You had your football magazines and you had your newspapers, and that was it. The idea that you couldn't just pick up a device and watch a goal seconds after it scored might seem strange and weird to some of our younger listeners, but that was the reality of the situation. But I think what's clear when you go through the book and when you listen to, or rather when you read what the players are saying, that they feel between themselves a real sense of connection that has lasted down the years, that perhaps players at clubs these days who win things and achieve things maybe won't feel because of the era in which they're doing it. Like there's a story, I think it's Perry Groves, who talks about how on the bus they would sit there and Tony Adams and Lee Dixon would be talking about, right, well, if I go here, you go here, or if I'm doing this, you do that, and they're analysing and talking about the game. And it might sound a bit like Old Man Yells at Cloud, and he's talking about, well, how can players do that if they're all wearing headphones on the bus and they're not talking to each other? Do you think that thing that has helped these relationships last down the years?
100%. And one of the lovely things about when we made the film that is connected to this book was that there was overlapping of the players getting together at various stages, and then a load of everybody came together, plus coaching staff and so on. When the film was premiered, and seeing their love for each other, and I use the word with a good reason, it wasn't just friendship. They really did look like a bunch of guys who loved seeing each other and felt transported to see one another as a group again. Was very, very special. And I think that because if you there's two things. First of all, when George Graham explains, and the players indeed themselves explain, the way that the team was forged, which was a very deliberate on George's part combination of getting rid of the prima donnas. He didn't fancy all the big stars sort of swanning around. That was not the kind of person he wanted to work with. Bringing through this fantastic generation of young players, and when you imagine getting Adams, Merson, Rocastle, Thomas through at the same time, more or less, even with the fringe players or slightly more fringe players like Hayes and Quinn and so on, is pretty remarkable. And then supplementing that very deliberately with players identified from the lower leagues or from less fashionable clubs that George Graham earmarked because he thought these are guys with talent and with potential, but what's more, they're really hungry. I want them to walk into the marble halls and think, Arsenal. Yeah. Oh my God, and he wanted people he could listen to. And actually he explained it in a way I quite liked, which was that when he was a youth coach, when he first got into coaching, the kids listened to him because they were young and they bloody well had to. And I think his feeling was, I can mould people who will listen to me. I can make them do what I want them to do, and they will do it. And we will develop this resilience, this organisation that is going to be the backbone of a successful team. And when he came into Arsenal, he thought, well, I can't have a bunch of 16-year-olds. However, I can have the good young players, and I can have players from outside that are hungry and that will listen to me and that are not going to mess me about and think that they're a bit special and swan around with their, perms and earrings and champagne Charlie and so on and so forth. So I think that part of it was that they were all on this sort of adventure together as a group of players. And they felt like they were part of something that was growing, and they were there from the off, most of them together. And the way that they worked and the way that they partied and the way that they were as a group, because there were obviously not the same level of distractions and there was not the same need to shut yourself away and try and not be driven mad by the public. The players, I think the camaraderie aspect was really natural because they trained hard, they played hard, they were a real gang of brothers in many ways. And although you wouldn't say everybody, you can't be naive enough to think, they were all amazingly close, because obviously you have little groups that were a bit more bonded than others. But overall, I think there was a recognition that everybody was great. And Tony Adams, I think, says, when he first claps eyes on sort of Dixon and Winterburn and Steve Bold, and there was the north-south divide was a big thing then in English football, and I think that's something that has got a bit clouded in recent years, where obviously it's such an internationalised game and things are different. But if you were a northerner or you were a southerner, it was or a Cockney, and it was different. Yeah, and they were a bit mistrustful, and it was like Adams thought, not sure about these guys. Are they going to understand what it's all about, what we're all about? And then he recognised quite quickly, it's like they're working class lads, and Stevie Bold or whatever is not that different from us lot from Essex working class. We're all they had the same cultural references. They were all pretty much British and Irish. And when you look on the team sheet, which is on the back of the book, the only foreign player is Bruce Scarborough, who's not from Britain and Ireland, in the entire Liverpool and Arsenal teams, which is the top two teams in the country. So everybody, they might have taken the mick out of each other's accents or whatever, but everyone would have watched the same television programs or listened to the same radio, because there wasn't that much choice compared to nowadays. Yeah. So I think people felt just naturally a bit more all part of the same gang. Yeah,
it's a smaller world. It was a smaller world back then. And yeah, like that's quite, that hadn't occurred to me. I'm just looking at the team sheets on the back of the book here now. And when you consider what the makeup of the Premier League is now and all the squads across the Premier League, it is a remarkable change. I know 30 years is not a short space of time either, but it is. It really is something. Let's talk just a little bit about George and what he achieved in bringing that team to the title. Liverpool at that point were by far and away the best team in England. They had been dominant for so many years. They were maybe the equivalent of, I don't know if you could say the equivalent of Manchester City now, but in terms of how they're perceived and how good they were, they really were an amazing team. And George Graham was appointed Arsenal manager, having come from Millwall. So the track record from his point of view wasn't one of great success, and I think people were a little bit wary about his appointment at that time. But I was quite curious and quite interested to see him talk very early on in the book about, reading lots of books about coaching and looking to other sports to find angles with which to be effective as a coach. And I guess people would think of Graham unfairly, I think, a bit, as somebody who was in charge of a team that played Dara football. That wasn't always the case. You know, it ended up being that way, but it wasn't always the case. So it was quite progressive, wasn't it? You know, A, the appointment of Graham in the first place, and B, the way that he assembled that squad and put it together and managed it.
Well, just on the subject of boring Arsenal, and it's one of those memories of the night, actually, is that I do remember, like, one of the first chants after the final whistle, there was this kind of almost manic chant of champions, 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 where you almost couldn't get the words out fast enough. It was like merging into like some kind of muddle. And then quite quickly after, it was boring, boring Arsenal in this sort of ironic way, which again, it's part of the history that we've come a long way since then. So some people would either maybe not even know about that element of the history or have forgotten about it slightly. But, you know, the reputation was still quite strong in those days. And Arsenal were top scorers that year. In fact, so much so, well, they won the title on goals scored. Goals, not even goal difference, goals scored. They had the same points and the same goal difference as Liverpool come the final reckoning. And it was the fact that they actually had scored, I think it was 3 more goals in the end, that made the difference over the season. So I think the boring Arsenal thing didn't really apply. It was a very exciting team. They were direct, but they were, you know, there was an energy about that team that was really exciting, and particularly away from home. Scoring 4 goals at West Ham, 4 goals at Nottingham Forest in a game that was on the telly. And games weren't on the telly very often then. That's the other thing that's kind of fascinating when you're doing that rewinding of time and comparing it to now. And I loved one of the stories that came out of talking to some of the people around the game, sort of, you know, that were involved but were not actually part of it, such as the referee and people who were involved in TV and so on the night production. The TV guy said that people had to know how long there was to go, because in those days there were not score lines or clocks on football sports screens. If anything was televised, it was considered sort of something that would. It was considered a bit uncouth. You know, it destroyed the kind of purity of seeing the images. And there was an argument between the TV producer, who was in the truck outside Anfield, and the person back at HQ. They were arguing about what to do about news at 10, because the game started late and they knew that they couldn't not have news at 10 and it wasn't going to be delayed. And what would they go to the game first or not? And that depended on if Liverpool carried on and won 1-0, it would probably be normal news. And if Arsenal managed to nick it, then that would be the first item. And then there was a whole discussion about, can we put the clock up? And someone said, no, it would look shit, you can't do that. And they went, we've got to put the bloody clock up. And then the little yellow clock appears in the corner of the screen, about 85 minutes. It's the first time it was ever done.
Yeah, that's mad, isn't it? One of the things I remember, actually, is, do you remember when a TV programme used to be on, and before an ad break, there used to be little black and white bars in the top corner?
Yes.
To let you know that there was an ad break coming. I'm not sure if it was only ever with live television or whatever, but that was there on the screen as well as the game drew to a close.
Yeah, well,
you wouldn't have seen that, obviously. You were you were in a different location, but yeah, I mean that's you know, something that's obviously been taken on. But just from the point of view of Liverpool, how good would you say that Liverpool team was at that particular moment in time? And you know, the sense that Arsenal had kind of blown the title by the results that led up to the trip to Anfield, and they dropped points, and it meant that this game became a shootout. I think most people would not have given them a chance. No,
and you know, all the classic sort of men against boys and you haven't got a prayer Arsenal headlines of the day were not necessarily considered to be, you know, provocative or unfair, but by most people fairly realistic state of the situation. And when you try and recall how great that Liverpool team were, it's hard to make comparisons, because they sort of set the standard in terms of a dynasty, and they've been the dominant team for 15 years, you know, most of the 70s, most of the 80s. where they won nearly all the time. And they, not only that, if you say, well, that's quite comparative to Manchester United under Ferguson, it's probably the closest you get to it. But Liverpool were winning multiple European Cups in that time as well. Not just the odd one, but like many. And not only that, they played possibly the best football in Europe. So they had that kind of touch of, when people think about the great Barcelona and almost rewriting how you imagine football to be played, I think the Liverpool team of the season before, of 87-88, where they won the double, and they had already had a successful team, and they had John Barnes and Beardsley, and they were a sublime football team to watch. They passed the ball better than anyone else had ever passed the ball, it seemed like, in football. And they had great flair on top of that. So they were absolutely the benchmark, not just for English football, but probably for world football at that time. And they were not in the business of sort of blowing things, really, very often. And the fact that Arsenal were inexperienced and young, I think the only person who had won a league in the whole squad was Kevin Richardson. So it wasn't like they had the experience. And I think that the fact that Arsenal had been in front for a long, long time. Liverpool obviously had a bit of a dip by their standards and were a bit off the pace. But since January, they were just winning and winning and winning and winning and winning. And even more remarkably, to continue that in the aftermath of Hillsborough, which was just something you almost can't imagine how they dealt with that, really. To carry on playing football and trying to win matches on the back of going to funerals and the sense of really
trauma.
overwhelming shock and trauma that probably wasn't dealt with, because again, you compare the 80s to now, and people didn't talk about stuff in the way that they would now. People didn't recognize mental health or trauma in the way that they would now. So I can't imagine the kind of internal suffering that people were going through, and they couldn't even talk about it or probably process it in any way. And how I don't know if there was much help around, but that wasn't that common in those days. You kind of had to get on with things on your own, really. So there was all that going on, but they were still remarkably, almost superhumanly consistent in the second half of the season. And Arsenal had a classic case of the yips in the last week of the season and dropped 5 points in 2 home games against teams they would have ordinarily probably won both matches. So hence the finale was set up in the way that it was. But it did certainly feel like everything pointed towards Liverpool. And I think what was also interesting is the psychological element, where even, it was quite interesting to hear some of the players talk about this themselves, where people like Dixon and Winterburn were quite articulate in trying to explain how it was okay to try and win the league against Liverpool, given what they'd been through. It was complicated because you're a professional footballer, or you're a fan, and you're very involved, and you care, and you've spent all season, or if you look a bit of a wider perspective, all your life building up to a moment where you've got a chance to win the league, and it's a dream, and then suddenly you think, well, should we? I don't even know if it's right anymore. Like maybe Liverpool should just win it. So these kind of things were going around inside people's heads as well, and it was difficult to work out what was okay. And
I mean, I think as well, you talk about the psychological aspect of it, the fact that Arsenal had been considered, they'd blown it and they dropped those points in those games. That could have made a lesser team kind of crumble in a way. And I guess it's a testament to the character of the players and the manager and his preparation and the way that he set up the team for example, he didn't go up to Liverpool until the day of the game. He didn't want the players stewing over being in enemy territory, if you like. And that was a change. And also, a change of formation as well. There were all those things that they had to contend with, which I think, in the cold light of day, here we are all these years later, when you add them all to that melting pot, the quality of Liverpool, the issues that were going on behind the scenes, the psychological trauma that I think everybody felt, not just Liverpool players and Liverpool fans, but football fans with Hillsborough, the feeling that maybe Arsenal had blown it, that they'd given away a great chance, and then you have to go and play. You know, it really does just add to this sense of drama. Was it Paul Merson who said something along the lines of, like, if I was on my holidays and I was reading this in a book, I'd throw the book down and say, this is the biggest load of shit I've ever read, because it was so incredulous.
Yeah. I think he said he'd throw it in the pool, which I think is even better. The idea of some book, or, you know, getting absolutely mashed in the water. But I mean, it was an impossible scenario, which is why it has the impact, and went on to have the impact that it had for people. Because, you know, we all have an understanding of the kind of order of things in life, generally, how things are sort of supposed to go. And when something happens that smashes through that, it feels quite powerful. So, but going back to what you were saying before, I think that George Graham is the one above all who deserves huge recognition for the almost flawless way in which he managed the days leading up to the game, as well as the game itself. And it probably would have been really easy to get that wrong. And he was a smart thinker. He loved his tactics, which everybody knew, and he loved his psychology, which was probably less known at the time, but it was a clear part of his way of working. And the things that were most critical to him were, first of all, to do everything possible to take the pressure off the players. So hence training on all the time that they spent together was very, very light. There was a real happy mood around once they got over the kind of catastrophe of the home games they'd blown against Derby and Wimbledon. I think they picked themselves up quite quickly, and it was a happy place at London Colney. And going up on the day of the game, again, that harkens back to George Graham being a student of things to do with sport, to give you those percentage points of advantage. And I love the story that he was influenced by Desmond Morris, the studier of animals and human behaviour, who had written a book called The Naked Ape, which was all about primates. And George had been influenced by this, and how when you're going into someone else's territory in the animal kingdom, that they'll fight and want to kick you out and do anything they can to protect their territory. And if you want to get away with it and not get killed yourself, you need to kind of get in and get out like a raid. Yeah. And he used to use the old John Wayne lines quite a lot, according to the players, who kind of almost thought, oh, this one again. But this idea of the cowboy kind of strolling into town, don't outstay your welcome, do your damage and get out. Sure. And that was his plan. And it did mean that there was a massive kind of air of relaxation. Although I enjoyed talking to the travel club manager, who, thought it was a joke when he was told that Arsenal were planning to go. George, change your plan. We're going to go take the coach up on Friday. Hang on, the game's on Friday night. George wants to go up Friday morning. But what do you mean you can't go up Friday morning? What if there's traffic? Which obviously was very much a big part of things in the end. And obviously the team had just about beaten that, thankfully. But he had this plan of doing it in this specific way. And then, quite apart from that, is all the tactical approach, which was really a genius shout from him, where everybody was saying, well, if you need 2 goals at Anfield, you've got to play 20 attackers, go for it. And he said it, and he made a wonderfully arch expression with his face, and it was like as if to say, you must be joking. And it's very pertinent when you look at even the Arsenal of today, and you think about how there's this elusive search for balance in the team. How can you be kind of solid enough at the back, and that can be your platform to really go and express yourself and do the damage when you've got your moments to hurt the opposition. And George was like, we don't concede. We got to score twice, yes, but if we concede a goal, we're not going to start scoring 3s and 4s. So let's keep this manageable. Yeah, and it worked brilliantly. I thought it was quite interesting to hear him talk about his own reaction to it in
in hindsight, where he sort of wishes a little bit that he might have been more emotional, or might have been able to, I guess, on a very basic level, enjoy it a bit more. But I wonder, could he have masterminded that kind of performance and that kind of tactical approach if he was a bit more emotional anyway? Do you know what I mean? Like,
it's a really good point, and I think you're probably right. And I think part of how the mechanics of the team and its relationship with George worked was that there was this fear, and there was this sense of if George tells you to do something, I really want to do it. I really want to not get bollocked by him.
Yeah.
Dixon told a nice story about when he would go into the changing room, just not of an average game, not specifically relating to this one, and George would have his piece of paper, because he would sit in the first half in the director's box, so he had an aerial view of everything, and then go down and lay into everyone as necessary, and sit down in the dugout in the second half. And he would try and take a peek over as he was coming in to see if his name was at the top of the piece of paper, and he said invariably it was. And he tried to go to the loo, and it'd be like, Dixon, where are you going? That you're not going to escape. You're going to get pelters if you're not doing what is expected of you. And I think that somehow he generated not just a respect and a kind of desire to please Mr. Graham and what have you, but also a sense that they trusted him. They believed that he was right invariably. And even if he came up with something where people would go, what are you talking about playing an extra defender when we've got scored 2 goals at Anfield? He managed to have a kind of status in the minds of the players and the group that if George says that, he must know what he's doing. So we'll do that.
Yeah.
Rather than, you can imagine in a modern dressing room, players whispering at each other, oh God, he's full of crap, or this, that, or the other, what are we going to do? Oh, don't do that. But I don't think that was what it was like. It was a different time.
Yeah, it sure was. Just finally, there are throughout the book, not just the recollections of players and George Graham and the staff and everything else, but fans. And reading them, I think what struck me was just how vivid people's recollections are, and their memories of where they were, whether they were at Anfield, whether they were watching it with friends in a pub somewhere, whether they were in someone's house, whether they were in wherever they were in the world. If they had to rely on the BBC World Service, for example, and they had to wait for a news bulletin to find out, how the game had gone and whether Arsenal had won, the sheer level of recollection is really something. And I guess in some ways you could say, well, look, you have this thing with memory, don't you, that you kind of create your own memories in a way, or you augment them over the years. But it certainly strikes me that in this case, it is one of those JFK moments where everyone remembers where they were because of just how big an event it was and what it meant for Arsenal and the football club. And those are fantastic to read as well.
Thanks. And that was something that I felt really inspired by, and really optimistic that when I sat down to try and start putting this thing together, I was very conscious of, there's no point just basically doing the film in book form, because the film's been out for a while and didn't really seem to be worth doing it that way. And I was very conscious that I wanted to make it have, some strong differences. And I think those differences come across in the fan testimony is a massive part of that, but also in the layers of being able to go off on tangents that were difficult to achieve in the film. So therefore, hearing the players, Michael Thomas and Paul Davis, for example, and even their teammates remembering what it was like as a black player in the late 1980s was, and that was very much part of the, of the times. Talking about hooliganism and that kind of era, and people like Nick Hornby and Alan Davis, as well as, less famous fans, have very vivid memories about what it was like going to games and how you were treated and being shoved up against walls and fences and the police and how it was back then. The trying to put across some of the deeper things that were going on sort of socially in terms of where football was back then was great to be able to go off and explore. But the fan stuff was something that just grew and grew and grew. And hopefully, I think when it's all put together, it does give you that JFK feeling of this scattering of people across the globe, literally, who remember with crystal clarity what they were wearing, a snippet of conversation, what somebody said to them. I mean, if you ask me what did somebody say in a conversation with you last week, word for word, or even yesterday, I hate to tell you, that's a massive struggle. Yeah. But people have a capacity somehow, because it was such an important memory, to remember what they were wearing, what exactly where they went, what they ate, what they drank, the little tiny details. What was on the video of the coach coming back from Anfield? I think there was a Blade Runner and a Crocodile Dundee, and various things like that again just place you very much exactly at your moment. And people are saying, I remember somebody writing in and saying how he had to go and do his run delivering sort of chipolatas and pork pies and this and that across his local area. His job as a sort of distributor of meat products, and he could remember everything he delivered, I think, and until he got to go home and settle down for the game. And he has a remarkable tale of a guy in Germany who'd just been posted out there as a new recruit to the British Army, and this was before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and he was positioned in a bit of checkpoint Alpha, I think, which was, people know of checkpoint Charlie, but this is further along in the east. So it was the access point to what was West Berlin. So it went right through a tract of land that was East Germany, and it connected essentially the West Germany to the little enclave of West Berlin. And he said they couldn't pick up any radio or anything like that went to the services. So he was kind of on his own, and somebody knew somebody who was able to record something, and he drove through the night to pick up a VHS and went back to the back. And you think, how is this possible when, nowadays it's on the telly and simultaneously on Twitter and on the radio, and you can hear, news of a goal almost before the kind of screeches of a celebration are actually happening in the stadium. It's also instant. And also global. And there was a lovely one from a guy who was out on holiday, I think in Corfu with his mates, couldn't find a pub, couldn't find a way to watch it, went and phoned his local pub at home to find out what was going on, and was on sort of hanging on the end of the phone for half an hour. when the goal goes in, goes running off up the road, and quite quickly realises he's been chased by two Greek blokes because he hasn't paid for the phone call. Because in those days, you didn't have a phone, so you had to go to a phone shop where there was little booths with telephones in them, and go through to the operator, and then you had to pay someone with cash at the end of the call.
Real money.
Abroad. Yeah, exactly. So just the sort of those little slices of life that are reminders of a different time. I think were really brilliant, and I really love the kind of collective picture that you get from all of that. And it makes me feel like all the good things that I'd like to go back to 1989 about. Sure.
Well, look, I think you've captured the football and the fan experience beautifully in this book. It really is a great read, and it's a real companion piece to the movie as well. It's not something that is just the movie in book form. It really does give you more depth and greater insight into everything that went on behind the scenes and on the terraces and around North London. So congratulations.
Thanks, Andrew. I just got to throw it out there that as well as being out in book form tomorrow, it's also out on Audible as an audio book read by Alan Davis, which is a real treat because
cool.
I couldn't really think of many people that I would rather do that task than him, and I think he's done a phenomenal job. So if audio is your thing, then head in that direction. But if like me you still like the written word, then the book's pretty nice too.
It's in all good bookshops from tomorrow, and on Audible, and I'm sure it's in digital format and everything else. But look, Amy Lawrence, good luck with it. I don't have to wish you luck because I think Arsenal fans are going to absolutely love this, and we'll chat to you soon.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. And, we probably shouldn't let today go just without reflecting on the importance of football in all of our lives. And, what's the time? Is it 2 minutes past 7? Sorry.
Had to be done. Look, there are things about, football that frustrate us and things that delight and enchant us. And what went on last night was quite delightful.
That's the thing. You never know what football's going to throw at you. And that's why we all love it.
That's it. Amy, thanks a million.
Cheers.
You can follow Amy on Twitter. She is at AmyLawrence71, at AmyLawrence71. And, of course, you can read her stuff in The Athletic. The book is available from tomorrow in all good bookshops. If you can, get it from your local independent bookshop. Keep them in business because we need more bookshops. If you have to order it online from a gigantic company that pays no tax, all well and good. But if you can, get it from your local independent bookstore. They will love you for it. They'll order it in for you if they don't have it, and they will very, very much appreciate your continued custom and support. Right, we better leave it there. Thank you very much, as always, for listening. Hope you enjoyed this special edition of the podcast. Back with what have we got on Friday? We've got an Arsecast Extra on Friday morning for you because we're playing late on Thursday night. So James and I will be here on Friday morning with an Arsecast Extra, hopefully talking about a good Europa League win for the Arsenal. Until then, take it easy. Cheers. Bye-bye. Coming soon to the official Tottenham bookstore, 180 Seconds of Glory. Relive those incredible 3 minutes when Heung-min Son's goal put Spurs ahead against Bayern Munich in the Champions League. The passion, the glory, the really tedious, annoying, slow singing. 180 Seconds of Glory. It's all we've got.